Okay, when it comes to storage in GCP, you have three options available to you. You have the persistent disk. So you would use persistent disk if you have to store blob storage. Then you have the cloud storage. So cloud storage is basically for storing objects. And then you have the file store, which is basically used for storing files and folders. So in this particular series, we'll be talking specifically about cloud storage. So after that, we'll be talking about block and then file storage. And then eventually we'll be doing a comparison on all three. So let's start off by talking about object storage and what object storage is. And so cloud storage is basically a service that is used in GCP for storing your objects in Google Cloud. Now, what are objects? So an object is an immutable piece of data consisting of a file of any format. So it could be a video file, it could be an audio file, a PDF, it could be any file. So the format of the file really does not matter. So you store objects in a container called bucket. So a bucket is basically a very important term for you to understand, and all buckets are associated with a project. So this is how the hierarchy of your particular cloud storage looks like. So you have a project which is basically part of an organization, and within your project you can create buckets, and within these buckets you can create objects. So a few things to note about these buckets are that these buckets have to have a globally unique name. So if somebody else has created a bucket of a certain name, then you cannot do that. You have to create a unique name that is specific for your particular bucket. Another important thing to note is that the name and the location of your bucket cannot be changed after it has been created. So within these buckets, you can store objects. So the objects are basically individual pieces of data that you store in your cloud storage. Now, there is no limit to the number of objects that you can create in a bucket. So that is one thing to note. And then there is no minimum size for a particular object. So you can even create an object of 0 MB. The maximum size, however, currently is 5 terabytes. So you cannot create an object of more than 5 terabytes. So another important fact to remember is that you can have metadata for each object, and these metadata can be used to add or to enrich object information. So you can store other information about that particular object within the metadata itself. Now, another very important point to note is that your object is immutable. So you cannot update your particular object. So all that you can do is you can delete it and re-upload it after you've updated it. So within your particular bucket, you cannot update a particular object. So this is a very, very important point to remember, that your objects are immutable. Now, a few things to note is that you cannot create a bucket within another bucket. So this particular hierarchy is not allowed. However, what you can do is you can actually create something called as a folder. So you can create a folder, and within this particular folder, you can add objects. Now, this is allowed. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the folders. So before that, let's talk about the hierarchy of how your objects and your bucket looks like. So whenever you create a particular bucket and add objects into them, what gets created is actually a flat hierarchy that looks something like this. So if you want to add another particular object, so it will get added and it will be linked to the bucket directly. However, we talked about folders. Now, even though you can create folders, these folders actually do not exist within your particular cloud storage. So what happens is, let's assume that you created an object named folder1.txt and the name of your bucket is your bucket. Now, the path to the object is your bucket. Basically, this is the name of the bucket, followed by the folder name, followed by the name of the file. But there is no folder named folder1 that gets created. So instead, what happens is that the string folder1 becomes part of the object name itself. So that is one important thing to remember. So this is one very important concept to remember. So it is basically a flat hierarchy. However, when you're viewing it in the console, you would think that there is a folder, even though there is actually no folder that exists. So this is another very important point to remember, that even though you can create folders, these folders do not exist, and they're basically just a illusion. And what actually happens is that the string or the folder is basically part of the object name itself. So please remember this, and this is something that is common not only for your cloud storage, but also for your S3 as well as for your Azure storage. So now let's look at ways in which you can actually access your objects. The most easiest way is basically using the console itself. Now you can also use a tool called gsutil. Gsutil is a command line interface that is provided by Google, so you can use that. You can also use client libraries that Google provides. So there are client libraries that are provided for a certain set of languages, including Java, Node.js, PHP. So you could use that, or you could use REST API. So if you do not have client libraries for your particular language, you can use REST APIs to access your particular object. So these are the four ways in which you can access your particular object. Okay, so now let's look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of using cloud storage. Now, since it has a flat hierarchy, you can make it highly scalable. So if you want to add more data into your cloud storage, all that you need to add are more data nodes at the back end, and your cloud storage will become infinitely scalable. So that is one big advantage. Now, this advantage, like I said previously, is because of the flat hierarchy of your cloud storage. You can also add rich metadata to your object. So adding more metadata makes it more easier for your application to understand the object and what it contains. Now, there's a very simple HTTP API to access your particular objects. And there is also a built-in CDN that you can integrate with your cloud storage if you want to decrease latency. You can also create versions for your particular objects. Now, that's something that we'll see in the upcoming chapters. And replication is inbuilt. So whenever you're creating an object within your particular bucket, it gets replicated multiple times. So this is inbuilt and you do not need to manually do it. So that's some of the advantages of using cloud storage. Certain disadvantages are that basically, since your objects are immutable, changes are time consuming. So if you want to make some changes to your objects, you basically need to delete them, make changes, and re-upload them. So another disadvantage is that latency is very high. And unlike your disk or your file systems, you cannot mount them directly to your operating system. So these are some of the disadvantages. So in our next chapter, we will see on how we can create a fest bucket and within that insert a fest object. So I'll see you in the next chapter.